The 2024 presidential election and coinciding Senate and governor's races are over a year and a half away, and yet there's already a lot of talk about them. One of the states I want to focus on in this video is Pennsylvania, more specifically the Senate race between Bob Casey and a mystery Republican challenger. We don't know who the Republican nominee is going to be yet. We still have about a year until the primary actually occurs, but many Republicans are getting very nervous about this seat in particular because the former nominee for governor, Doug Mastriano, who ran back in 2022, is expected to announce his candidacy for this Senate seat. And we're going to talk about why that's going to be incredibly problematic for Republicans and why they should do everything in their power to stop Doug Mastriano from being the nominee and nominating David McCormick in his place. So we're going to dive into all of this in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So as you'll notice right off the bat, this article from Business Insider is over a year old. This is from June of 2022, or about a year old. We're getting there. And it basically says that Pennsylvania Republicans want David McCormick, who had just lost the primary at this point about a month ago, to run against Democrat Bob Casey. And when you actually read this article, it's not really surprising why they would say this. For one, David McCormick got incredibly close in the 2022 Pennsylvania primary. He lost to Dr. Oz by less than 1,000 votes and had a lot of strength in central and western Pennsylvania, two areas of the state where Dr. Oz did much more poorly as compared to Donald Trump in 2020, especially here in western PA. You see shifts in favor of the Democrats by in some cases even double digits. And these aren't even blue counties. These are safe red counties, places like Elk County, places like Forest County. These areas have shifted considerably to the left, and that's really because these areas did not have a candidate that resonated with them. You had a drag on the ticket with Doug Mastriano sort of driving out Democratic turnout, not just in urban and suburban areas, but all across the entire state, and couple that with a candidate that seemed out of touch with the everyday voters of Pennsylvania. And of course, when you put those two factors in together, you get a considerable Republican loss. Republicans lost the seat in Pennsylvania by 5 points, which is pretty embarrassing considering the fact that Republicans had only lost Pennsylvania in the presidential contest by just 1.2% just 2 years earlier, and then they go on to lose it by about 5 points in a midterm election that was supposed to favor the GOP. So when we look at the Pennsylvania Senate election in 2024, Republicans are going up against a much more formidable Democrat. Bob Casey is the incumbent. He's already won 3 decisive election victories, the smallest of which was 9 points back in 2012. So he's almost always been at or near double digits. But Republicans think that with the right nominee, they can narrow up this race considerably. And of course, that nominee would likely be David McCormick. One of the benefits of David McCormick is that he's able to self-fundraise. David McCormick himself is worth an estimated over $100 million in assets and probably potentially has even more money than that. And if his primary is any evidence, he's willing to put a lot of his own money into his race. So already money wouldn't be as much of a problem for McCormick if he were to run for this seat, so Republicans can focus offensively on taking back the Senate in other states, places like Ohio, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Montana. But this race in particular, I think, is sort of flying under the radar now because most people are considering the Republican going up against Casey dead on arrival. And I don't necessarily think that's the best attitude for Republicans to have. While it's an extremely uphill battle, you want to go on offense in as many states as you can. And McCormick is certainly somebody who I think would have strength in the places where Oz doesn't. Western Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania. David McCormick is from West PA. It's pretty evident in his primary performance. He did very well there. And I think he has more of a connection to the state of Pennsylvania than Oz did. So I think the attacks of him being an outsider won't land as hard as they did with Oz, especially because Oz's team really wasn't experienced or handling the campaign very well until late summer into the fall. So they bungled the early months of the general election campaign. And I think that ultimately doomed them in the general in retrospect. Again, obviously at the time, I thought Dr. Oz was going to win. The polls had indicated that. The national environment would have indicated that. But one of the things I learned, of course, after the 2022 midterms is that the national environment doesn't mean all that much. Candidate quality is almost everything in these types of races. And I think a stronger candidate than Dr. Oz potentially could have won this race. Potentially. I think Doug Mastriano, who we're going to talk about in just a second, probably doomed any Republican running against John Fetterman at the end of the day. So there's been some indications that Steve Daines, who is the chair of the NRSC, he's in charge of recruiting and helping to fundraise for Republican senatorial candidates. He's basically indicated that if David McCormick jumps into the race, he will back him, essentially avoiding a pretty contested primary. Of course, the PA GOP, which really dropped the ball last year, is trying to avoid a crowded field to try and get David McCormick essentially the nomination, because he's really their only chance if they ever want to actually be able to flip this seat. And, you know, even if he doesn't win, he'll probably make the race a lot closer and help the top of the ticket nominee potentially for the Republicans, or at least that's their thinking. Because, of course, if there's a blowout in the Senate race with somebody like Mastriano, who loses by, let's say, 20 points, there's almost no way that a Republican is going to win Pennsylvania at the top of the ticket. So with that out of the way, of course, let's talk about Doug Mastriano himself. So if we take a look at the Wikipedia page for the 2024 Pennsylvania Senate race, Doug Mastriano is in the announcement pending category, which essentially means he's waiting to announce his run for the Senate. Now, of course, if we go back to his disastrous 2022 gubernatorial performance, Doug Mastriano did worse in basically every single part of the state. If we pull up the results from Pennsylvania specifically, and we take a look at the areas that trended away from the Republicans as opposed to 2020, it was essentially the entire state. Every single part of the state trended away from Republicans. Doug Mastriano almost lost, traditional Republican strongholds like Lancaster County. He lost Luzerne County, which was a county that Donald Trump won by a safe margin back in 2020. Just did really, really awfully across the entire state. And, you know, there was a belief among some, and I was a little bit guilty of perpetuating this narrative, that Doug Mastriano would be able to reinvigorate turnout in rural areas. And quite frankly, that was a very dumb thing to say in retrospect, especially considering that you have to consider that there's moderate and independent voters in every part of every state, including rural areas, and Doug Mastriano was incredibly toxic to independent and moderate voters, even in rural areas where people thought he would do exceptionally well. But his performance, a 30% showing in Allegheny County, disastrous. Trump got 39. 29% showing in Montgomery, Trump got 36. 36% in Chester, Trump got 40. 39% in Bucks, Trump got, I believe, 46 or 47% in Bucks County. Either way, just a total collapse of support for the Pennsylvania Republican nominee for governor. And Doug Mastriano really thinks that he can win it this time again. I think that notion's pretty laughable given such an awful performance. And some people will point to the argument that, well, he wasn't really funded properly by the RGA. And that is true. He didn't really get any funding from the RGA. But given this result and given the extreme views of Doug Mastriano on Stop the Steal, abortion, January 6th, there was no way he was going to win this governor's race. Absolutely none. Even if he had a fundraising advantage, I don't think he would have won this race, because I don't really think with just the most basic competency from a Democratic opponent that those unpopular issues wouldn't be exploited. But nonetheless, enough about Doug Mastriano's performance. Let's take a look at the primary. Currently, Doug Mastriano is leading David McCormick. Again, we've only got one polling source, and it is a Democratic-leaning polling source. But Doug Mastriano is leading the primary. And I think in some ways, Doug Mastriano is being baited into this race by Democrats under the allure that he'll win the primary easily and would actually have a shot in the general. And again, as I just pointed to earlier, Doug Mastriano has absolutely zero shot in the general. There is no way Doug Mastriano will beat Bob Casey ever. It's never going to happen. And, you know, some Republicans are of the logic that, well, we're not going to beat Bob Casey anyway, so why not just run Doug Mastriano? And I would simply just point to the down ballot consequences of running a candidate like Doug Mastriano. You get somebody on the ballot who only gets 41.7% of the vote. He's dragging down the Senate nominee. There's no question that Doug Mastriano hurt Dr. Oz in his Senate bid. Dr. Oz got 46% of the vote, so he outperformed Mastriano pretty considerably, you know, especially when you look at some of these northeastern and collar counties. You know, he was able to win Luzerne by 9 points, able to sort of narrow it up in these other counties. But Obviously, that's not the only reason Oz lost. Oz kind of lost on his own merits as well, but there's no question that this would have been a much closer race had Mastriano not been on the ballot at all to energize Democratic turnout around the state. Pennsylvania Republicans also lost the state house in Pennsylvania by 1 seat, and thankfully for them, they were able to keep the Senate because most of the seats were not up during 2022. But regardless, there were disastrous down-ballot consequences. Of course, if you look at some of the House races out of Pennsylvania, Republicans lost all of the competitive races, essentially, that were potential pickups for them. Again, Pennsylvania 8, Pennsylvania 7, Pennsylvania 17. All 3 of these districts should have went red. I had them going red because that's the way they would have, logic would have indicated they go based on the trends, based on the partisan lean of the districts, and based on the national environment we were expecting. And that didn't happen. And part of that is because of Doug Mastriano, especially when you look at a close race like Pennsylvania 7. How many Democrats did Doug Mastriano bring out to vote with his extreme views? Quite a number, I would argue. And, of course, repelling independents as well. So overall, Doug Mastriano has 0 chance at the general election against Bob Casey. David McCormick at least has somewhat of a shot. And I think that's why Republicans are trying to put all the effort they can into backing him. Now, I'll remind you, Doug Mastriano won the primary only by a plurality. He only got 44% of the vote, roughly speaking. And, one of the reasons why he was able to win the nomination is because the Pennsylvania GOP did not intervene in this primary. They did not try to get the candidates, Bill McSwain, Dave White, to drop out and get behind the second place contender, Lou Barletta. I certainly think that would have helped quite considerably in the primary in stopping Mastriano from getting the nomination, because in hindsight, he was certainly going to lose, and I think Pennsylvania Republicans knew when he got the nomination he was going to lose, and it really was just demoralizing for the state party. And in order to get some credibility back with voters, they need to make sure that somebody like Mastriano never gets the nomination in Pennsylvania again, because he's going to lose, and he's going to lose quite considerably. So obviously it'd be the biggest gift for the Democrats if Doug Mastriano was the nominee. Again, there's no way you have a nominee lose by 15 points in a purple state in a year that's supposed to benefit Republicans, and he's going to run and take out a very powerful Democratic incumbent. It just doesn't happen. So McCormick's really the only viable alternative to Mastriano. I mean, you've got some other names in here. You've got Carla Sands, who I don't really think is going to go anywhere in the primary. She didn't last time. Stacey Garrity, who's the state treasurer, I suspect she might decide to run for re-election. Again, if she decides to jump in the race, she's sort of going to split that non-Mastriano vote, and I think that's going to hurt the Republicans in the long term. So I think the GOP and the PA GOP and the Republican Senatorial Committee, they really want to make sure that McCormick jumps in the race so that this is a head-to-head race, because they believe that they can actually win that. And I think they probably could. Again, Mastriano only got the plurality last time, and Mastriano can't raise money. David McCormick can actually raise money. Mastriano, besides being a very bad candidate on the issues to a lot of voters, also was unable to fundraise effectively. David McCormick has a lot of money, and I think ultimately, since Mastriano could barely get on the airwaves back in 2022, McCormick will be able to run some ads and probably win the primary fairly easily in a two-way race. But that's if it's a two-way race. And, we've got about a year or a little bit more to go. McCormick's not expected to announce his decision for Senate until late 2023. At least that's what this source is giving us. But we'll see what ends up happening. Obviously, Republicans want somebody like McCormick over Mastriano if they want any chance whatsoever at flipping the seat. And I stressed again, I have this as a likely Democratic seat. It's going to be very hard for the GOP to flip, but it is a presidential year. Turnout's going to be a lot different, and Pennsylvania is going to be much closer at the top of the ticket, regardless of who the nominee is. So it's really a question of who the Republicans decide to run for the Senate and who they decide to run for president will ultimately determine whether or not Pennsylvania is really going to be that competitive in this Senate race. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.